One of the things you realize when you kind of separate yourself from your normal life is that there are some things that are true about the country that we live in. And one of the things that I discovered was true, that in the United States, in the Estados Unidos, we are maybe the most divided place on the planet. I mean, it's just incredible, the clans and the sub-clans and the teams and the things that divide us up. I mean, we divide at maybe the top of the hierarchy by race. I mean, oh my goodness, we got white, black, brown, red, yellow, the whole rainbow of color. And so we divide people based on that. So that becomes this first identifier. And then within that, we discover that we have these ethnic identifications. So, just within one group, we have Scotch, Irish, English, French, all the European, and we identify there. And then even within those, we subdivide one another up. Like, well, are you Northern Irish, or worse yet, were you a Protestant or a Catholic? Which side of the trouble? It just saps your energy to think of this. And, we got all that, and then we layer on all the other stuff that we divide over. Well, I'm an Idahoan as opposed to, those poor people in California. What else do we do? Countless things that we divide each other up over. And they're silly. I mean, you think about the silliest, most base things that we divide over. A member of the Raider Nation that may walk into the store, silver, black, white, whatever their colors are, would never be caught dead in Seahawks blue and green. I mean, seriously, it's like, who cares? Somebody cares. I mean, this is important to somebody. So we have division, and the whole idea of the United States, of a people group, just almost becomes a falsehood. It's like you're a group within this thing that's supposed to be a unity of people. That's supposed to be an identifiable people group in the world. Well, of course, my thinking always turns back to God's church. And of course, the sad reflection that I made was that we do the same thing here. That God's church has been through this history of splitting up. The first division comes about in the year 1054. And that is the first great schism. And the Greek Orthodox Church and what becomes the Roman Catholic Church is the first big division. Now, Christ had never intended for his church to break apart. He intended for his church to be united, to be together. But right away, we divided that church. And that's 1054, so that's roughly 1,000 years after Christ for that first division. The second big division is just 500 years later, when Luther and the rest divide the Protestant and the Catholic Church. So we divide there again. So now we have three major bodies. And of course, we know from there on that it has been this cellular level reduction of the church into smaller and smaller and smaller groups. I mean, we had Lutheran, Presbyterian, this and this and this, but then even within there, the groups subdivide. Come on, how many flavors of Baptist are there? How many flavors of Baptist are there, and what's the difference between them? Here's the danger in that. It sounds harmless. It sounds harmless because we identify with our clan, and okay, that's cool. But the world doesn't look at the church that way. The world looks at us and says, you guys can't agree on anything. They say, well, you're Baptist. Well, what kind of Baptist are you? And we say the regular right kind, right? But, they ask, what's the difference between you and those Southern folks? And we say they speak with an accent, and so it's difficult to understand. I mean, seriously, who knows the differences between a North American Baptist and a Southern Baptist and a conservative Baptist and a particular Baptist, and I mean, on and on and on and on. Now, it's one thing to divide God's body over doctrinal issues. That's where the major schisms have occurred in the history of the church. They broke apart over major doctrinal issues. But major doctrinal issues should not, secondary doctrinal issues should not be subdividing and breaking up the church, And we talked about a few of those in Sunday school, whether you use wine at communion or grape juice. There should be no division there. There's some liberty in there, but that's not a divisible issue. A primary issue is let's say, the Trinity. Do you hold to the belief in the Trinity? There are Christians who do not hold to the belief in the Trinity. They are oneness Pentecostals, and they believe in a modalist form of Jesus. That is, Jesus or God appears in different ways at different times, rather than Father, Son, Spirit. Which has been the accepted belief of the church forever. So there is a primary distinction there. But then you get into things like the millennium. This is clearly a secondary issue. It is not something on which you can rest, assured. Because there are theologians that will say Christ will come before the millennium. There will be a group who say he comes after the millennium. There are some that will say there is no millennium. And all of them, by going to scriptures, are right. So the fact is, we don't know. Where we know one thing to be sure, Jesus Christ is God. Jesus Christ is the deity. He is God in human form. That is a sure thing. And we would divide with a body that says he is not. That's incorrect belief. But to argue over things like the millennium, to argue over how you practice communion, that does not present the love of God to the world. So you look at our country, you look at the church, you just look at the general state of things, and it seems as though we forget what lies at the core of everything. We forget what is the most central thing. And especially here in the church, the most central thing for us is the gospel, period. The gospel lies at the center of all of God's word here. The gospel lies at the center of who we are and who God says that we are. The gospel lies at the center of our doctrine. It lies at the center of our faith. It lies at the center of all that we do, all that we say that we believe. And it should lie at the center of us in mission. It should lie right at the core of how we exercise for mission. And one of the core tenets in the gospel, one of the things that we have to remember, that we should be committed to, wholeheartedly and completely, is this truth. And this has to do with division. At one time, every one of you was divided from God. Every one of you was separated from God. And if you have believed in the gospel, if you have placed the fullness of your faith in Christ, you are now not divided from God. That is a core truth. That is the centerpiece of the gospel, is the centerpiece of our identity. So the next question becomes, who are we? What are we? What are we to do based upon that truth, that core truth? If you have your Bibles, we were in Ephesians 2, and strangely enough, we are still in Ephesians chapter 2. Now, I want to draw your attention back for a second where we were. You remember that we had looked at Paul's memory verse, that saying where he's saying, you're saved by grace and not by works, so that no one can boast. He says that not because nobody had ever heard that before, but he says that so that we will remember. He says that so that we will once again focus on that truth and focus on the importance of that truth in our life. One of the things the Bible tells us over and over and over is to remember. Is to remember. And some of us, it's a struggle to remember things, but the Bible tells us, page after page after page, remember. You know, in some instances, it is God saying, I will remember. Not because he's going to forget, but as a reminder to us that he remembers, that he calls things forward. In other instances, it's us remembering. You know, if you just go back into Genesis, God says, I will remember the covenant that I make. Now, God doesn't say that because somehow it's going to slip his mind. God's saying that because you best remember the covenant that we made between us. I'm going to remember it. You need to remember it as well. A little further along in Genesis, the people say, hey, God, remember you're our God. Again, not because God forgets, not because it somehow slips its mind, but as a remember to us. Hey, we made a covenant. God is our God. We're going to say this out loud. So remember, remember, remember. Now, there is another favorite remembrance that we have in Jeremiah 31, where God says, this is what God remembers, I will remember their sins no more. Now, we bank on that, don't we? That's something that we remember day after day after day. So when Paul in Ephesians says, hey, remember, you were saved by grace. You didn't do anything. You didn't earn this. You're not somehow special in God's eyes because you're saved. You were saved because of God's mercy alone. You were saved because God looked down upon your state, upon the fact that you were divided from him, and he made the way that you could be saved. So don't boast in it. Don't bring any of it on yourself. Do nothing but follow after him and his commandments. So that's where he left off. Now we're going to pick up in verse 11 this week, and listen to the first thing he says. Therefore, in light of that, therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Now, we lose the picture that comes along with this. And I had thought that since the weather's been so nice for the past couple days, we would have a little object lesson. I would make you all go stand out there and stare at the wall. But then, the logistics of getting everybody out and then back in. But that's the picture that Paul is painting. Because at one time, in the temple, and even back to the tabernacle, the portable tent, remember? At one time, there was a wall, a dividing line, where if you were not one of God's people, you could go no further. Okay, so you picture the temple, and you picture a wall, and outside that wall was the only place that a Gentile could go. You would look into the temple, and you could see what's going on in there. You could see the lives of the people going in and out. You could see the hope that they had. You knew, because you lived with these people, of the promise that God had visited upon their life. You knew the covenant that they were. You knew all these things, and yet there was that wall. And you had no hope of ever going over the wall, under the wall, around the wall. None. You could not sneak in because you would be pushed back out. If you got closer to the Holy of Holies, they probably would have killed you. You were not allowed in there. No matter how good of a person you were, no matter how bright and shiny your smile was, no matter how nice you were, it didn't matter. You had no hope. That's what Paul is saying is remember. Remember that at one time, no matter how good of a person you were separated from God by a wall that you couldn't climb, you couldn't break down, you couldn't change, and there was no way for you to change it. You could not cause yourself to become one of God's people. You could not simply name yourself as one of God's people. You could not get a ticket that gave you, permission to be nothing. You had no hope. No hope. None hope. And then he says this, like in 14. Well, let me read 13. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. So it is the blood of Christ that breaks down that wall, that removes the wall, that allows you and I to be a part of the people of God. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and its regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. I like that Paul is concise in what he's saying and doesn't use too many words. He says it's Jesus Christ that breaks down the wall. It is Jesus that ceases the hostility between you two. It is Jesus that calls out both to you, the Gentiles who are far away, and calls out to the Jews, to the Jewish population, both of you. He calls out to simultaneously and says, come, because he's not creating a new divided world. Note this. He is uniting everybody. Everybody. He's taking those who were far away, those who were near, those who were Gentiles, those who were Jews, those on this side of the wall, those on the other side. He's taking all those and he's bringing them together. And as soon as he does that, as soon as the blood of Christ melts people together, what happens to the divisions that formerly existed? They're supposed to be gone, right? They're supposed to be gone. The church, and don't hear what I'm not saying, the church was meant from day one to be Catholic. That's with a small c. Not big C, with a small c. Catholic means everybody. Catholic means for all. The church was meant to be all of God's people together. Right? The ideal for the United States was we would all come from different places and we would be together. We would be identified in the one group. The church is meant to be identified as the church. But we divide, we break, we subdivide, we create this clan and that clan, and what it does is it weakens and weakens and weakens and weakens our mission in the world. It makes it so hard for us to take this gospel, because you present the gospel to somebody in this hand and they say, well, this guy over here said the gospel's this, and this lady over here told me that the gospel might be this, and it becomes weak, it becomes ineffective. Paul says to remember the time at which you were divided. And one of the things that you and I have always got to keep in mind is that there was a time when we had no hope. Now, maybe we didn't know it. Maybe we didn't realize there was a time in our life where we had no hope. We might have been naive to that fact. We might have purposely ignored that fact. But there was no hope. None. Without Christ. When we realize that, when we call that memory up day after day, we remind ourselves of who we were, what we were, where we were, and we look at ourselves now, realize that no hope, a lack of hope, a life that didn't have or didn't show any hope. It makes a big difference because that reinvigorates your faith. That ignites it, it warms it, it gives passion to that faith. It makes it so that we want to have others know that same hope. And the reminder that he's making here, remember this. You at one time were on the other side of the wall. He tells us that here 20 centuries later. He says, remember, there are still people on the other side of that wall. There are still people staring at that wall, that barrier between themselves and God. There are people who have no hope. And our memory is meant to ignite the passion, is meant to ignite our action to help those people get to the other side of the wall, to come over and know this love of Christ. There are people in this world who face this wall of grace, them on one side, grace on the other, and they're trying to find a way to work themselves over that wall. They are trying in their own efforts to dig under the wall or to break a doorway through the wall or to knock the wall down completely. They're trying to do that in their own power, in their own efforts. We have to remember the core of the gospel, that it is God's grace that knocked down that wall. It is God's grace that will knock down the wall for those people. We don't serve them well by finding ways for them to knock down the wall themselves. We serve them well by sharing the core of the gospel with them. That God's grace is this free gift that He's just reaching out, offering, that He wants people to accept. We have to remember that. We have to remember that some people face this wall with indifference. They don't know that they should care about this. They're going through their lives either thinking that everything's going to be okay in the end, or convincing themselves that everything is just going to work out fine in the end. If there is a God, He can't be all that mean. If there is no God, we're just going to turn into dirt, whatever it is. But they're convinced in their own mind that this wall maybe doesn't exist, that that nothing has separated from God. But you and I, through our example, need to remember who we were, where we are now, what we used to do, what we have been removed from. What held us down before, what has set us free now. In that memory and in the lives that we live, we show that there is a truth about God, that there is a truth about the gospel of Christ, that there is something beyond this life, and that Jesus is the evidence of that. And that we cannot go to our grave, we cannot go to our final breath indifferent to what happens in the world. We have to help people to understand that there's only going to be two choices, there are only two ends exposed by the truth here. There is eternity with God, there is eternity separated from God. And it's up to us to remember our change so that we can share that change with others. There are people today that face a wall They face this wall of language, of culture. There are people who look at this wall and say, I can't have the hope that's on the other side of that because no one's speaking to them in their heart language. There are people, maybe just our neighbors all around us here, that look at that wall and say, I can't have that hope. I want it, but I can't have that hope because the two cultures are too different. But here's what we have to remember. Here's what Paul says to remember. You are a new humanity. You are a new humanity, and you are to invite others into that humanity. God made one new people. He didn't make a new people with all kinds of separate clans in it. He brought the two sides together and made one. And so all of us that are Christ's people must remember that fact and must use that fact in order to extend the hope to others. And if that requires that we learn to speak another language, if that requires that we discover a different culture, that's what we're called to do. Because God's purpose is to bring others into this new humanity. That's a lot to remember. I haven't seen anybody taking notes, so it's okay. I can go through this again. Listen, we have to remember to act. We have to remember who we are then, who we are now. We have to remember what changed us. It was Christ and His grace alone. We have to remember that we have been privileged to be a part of God's redemptive mission. That He has called every one of us into service. These are the things that we have to remember. Remembering for me, is very personal. And I suspect for each one of you, it is equally personal. Remembering, we can look back in our lives and we can see the very moment that we had no hope, and then we did. You can recall that moment as if it were yesterday. The moment we looked at that wall, we said, I think I want what's on the other side of that, but I don't know how to get it. And then the wall was knocked down. That's what we have to remember. We have to remember our lack of hope so that we can extend that hope to others, the hope that we have. We've got to be reminded day after day after day that it is God's grace, that it is God's mercy, that it is God's love, that it is God's will by which you and I are saved, transformed, and given hope. And it's that same way that our neighbors, that our relatives, that the people that we encounter day by day will also see on the other side of that wall and see the hope that we have and the hope that we want to extend. I remember, you remember, and I hope that with Paul's reminder here, we will all remember and make a memory for somebody else. We will extend the hope that's on the outside of the wall, the hope that's in here, the hope to somebody else who's desperately looking for it. Amen?